So I'm going to be interviewing Brian. He lives in Texas at the moment, and he's a former member of the Mormon Church, and I'm just looking forward to speaking to Brian and hearing his story. So welcome, Brian, to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dawn.
You're welcome. I'm really interested in hearing about your experience because I don't know a great deal about the LDS Church, so I'm really interested to hear about it. Just sort of tell us about your story and how you first got involved with them.
Yeah, so my family had been in and out of the church. My grandmother and grandfather, and then my mother. So I was familiar with them on a superficial level as a kid growing up. I'd been to church with them a few times, but I wasn't there all the time. And then when I was 11, turning 12, my grandmother decided, it's time to stick the missionaries on Brian and make sure that he's a member of the church. So that's what happened. The missionaries came and we went through the lessons. And I was turning 12, so with all the wisdom of a 12-year-old, the Book of Mormon challenge, which was to pray about whether the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, and like I said, the wisdom of a 12-year-old went and did that. And a lot of the times when I'm talking to Christians, they'll ask, did you get a feeling? And it's a very important thing for Mormons. A lot of Mormonism is built off of and based on an individual person's feelings. So, I did. When I said the prayer, I got a feeling, and that was good enough for me. And, of course, biblical understanding that, we're not to trust our heart because the heart is deceitful and wicked. That was not in my mind at that time. So it was, let's join the church, and I did. I was baptized into the Mormon faith at 12, and proceeded to be very, very active and devout. When I was going, it was a 3-hour block, and on Sunday, and then on Wednesday you would have activities, and we would go to that I'd go to that as well. And for me, it was Mormons identify themselves as different kind of Mormons based on how they became a member of the church. So for some people, it's sort of just a social thing, and it's like, well, I don't want to lose the social aspect of being a member of this church. That was never the thing for me. For me, it was, this is the one true church. This is Jesus Christ's church on the earth, and I'm a member of this church because of that. And what happened for me was I proceeded to get to that age of going on a mission, which was 19, and I had been dating the woman that's now my wife, and has been my wife for almost 20 years now. And I kind of was at a crossroads where I went, do I go on this mission or do I marry my wife? And I knew if I married my wife that the disappointment that I would deliver to my bishop and the leaders in our ward would be immense. But I knew that I didn't want to leave my wife, girlfriend at the time, for 2 years. So it really was an immense amount of pressure. And I decided to marry my wife. And when I made that decision, it was an immediate backlash. It was an immediate being ostracized from the group. I would show up on a Sunday, and I was no longer, Brian, this guy who's, young guy who's preparing to go on his mission, and he's filled with the Spirit, and he's going to go and baptize lots of people. Now I was the guy who has a faith problem. There's obviously something wrong because I didn't go on my mission.
Could I just ask about that, actually? Because for people listening, I'm wondering myself, so this mission, I know that young Mormons go for 2 years, don't they, preaching actively. Tell us, why were you ostracized then? Is this something that's it's a rule, it's something that every single young person has to do? What's the situation with that?
So it's not a rule. If you talk to an LDS person, they're going to tell you that there's no requirement for you to go and there's no rule for you to go. But there's very much a unspoken rule that says you go. And there is, you have to remember, many Mormons live in a very tight bubble, and only Mormons are part of that. So within that bubble that you create, everyone is LDS. So if you don't go, it is almost like you are bursting that bubble. And I always say in Mormonism, there is a demand of perfect obedience. And the mission and the amount of pressure that are put on people. I know numerous guys that I grew up with that they only went on their mission. They didn't go on their mission as a testament of their faith. They went on a mission because to survive in that society, in that group, you have to go. And if you don't go, you're going to pay a price up into exclusion from the group.
Yeah, I've heard some strange things about these missions, such as people are away from their homes and families and they have to live permanently with another person. What's all that about?
Yeah, you don't talk to your family. You can't, it's changed, but back when I would have gone, I wouldn't have been able to talk to my family at all. No communication.
Wow.
Besides a phone call on Mother's Day and a phone call on Christmas, they have become more because they're getting so few missionaries now entering into the field. Because of the oppressive demands that they put on them, they've changed it a little bit. But the one thing that hasn't changed is the demand of perfect obedience to go. And if you don't go, then you have to expect that you're going to face some sort of a problem. And for me, that's what happened. So I didn't go, and I got married, and my wife and I, we got married civilly, which that's another big thing in Mormonism. But so we're married, and in our ward building, it was basically, you walk in and you got 100 eyes on you, and it was a pressure that was provided by the members in the ward, and a disappointment. I had people, because I grew up very poor, so I had people in the church who said that they were going to pay for my mission fully. And when I didn't go, those people let me know how disappointed they were. So my wife and I went through our first bout of inactivity in the church. At that point, we stopped going, and it wasn't a faith thing. It wasn't like we didn't believe or that we had a belief problem. It was merely, it was very difficult to operate in that society, being ostracized to the degree that we were. And so we were in California. All of this took place in California, and then we moved to Seattle, Washington about a year later. And when we moved to Seattle, Washington, we didn't have that problem. I wasn't the guy who didn't go on a mission, and my wife wasn't the woman who made the guy not going to mission. We were just two regular Mormons that our new ward didn't know about. So it was great. We were like, we don't have these problems anymore being ostracized, so we immediately went back to church. For us, we were married civilly, which in Mormonism, that's a big deal, because the pastor who marries you will say, until death do you part. And in Mormonism, they believe that if you are married and sealed in a Mormon temple, that it is not until death do you part, it is for all time and eternity. And on top of that, one of the biggest things for Mormons, and it was for my wife and I, is family, is to be sealed together with your family forever. So it was the most important thing to us. You know, we were like, we want to fix this till death do you part thing, and we want to be sealed for time and all eternity. So we engaged on a course that our church leaders set for us, which was a 1-year program where we had to take classes and then, you know, be devout members, which included paying our tithing, obeying the word of wisdom, which is we're not going to drink coffee, we're not going to drink tea, not going to drink alcohol, and a bunch of different things. And we had to do that to be considered worthy enough to go into a Mormon temple, so we can be sealed for time and all eternity.
Wow. Okay. So what was it like inside the Mormon temple? I presume that ceremony went ahead, did it?
Yeah, so we got to the point, and I remember the gal who was teaching us, sweet older lady who was teaching us on the classes that they made us take. She told us beforehand, I remember it pretty clearly. She goes, you know, you just be open for anything when you go into the temple. And so the day came, and it was in December 2004. We went into the temple, and we went into the temple as devout members of the church, believing that it's the only true church. And when we came out of that temple experience that day, it had created a big problem for us. And the ceremony in the Mormon temple is very strange, and for me personally, it was very uncomfortable. There were, and this is back in 2004. They've changed it some, but when I went, you were given blessings and anointings that involve being touched on different parts of your body. That was very strange. You are told that the name that your parents gave you is not the name that God knows you by, and that you are then given a name that God has given you. And I remember when that happened, feeling very there's a certain pride in that, and that God has given me my own name. But then for me personally, being bothered by that as well. And later, after the fact, I found out that anybody who would have gone into a temple across the world that day, the day that we went, would have gotten the exact same name that I got and that my wife got. And that is the way they do it. It's all the same name for every day. So they pick 31 male names, 31 female names, and it only matters what day you go in, you get that name. So, but then when we went through the other ceremonies, I mean, we were doing chants, and I remember being in what's called the endowment session, and in the endowment session, before they start, you have to imagine, the doors close and you're in this big room with a bunch of people, and a voice comes over the intercom, and you're about to make covenants with God. If you don't want to do that, leave now. And I'm in my mind, because I'm already kind of creeped out, I'm thinking, yeah, you know what, I should probably leave. But then imagine this, my wife is on the other side of the room, and it's basically like I would be standing her up on our wedding day to be married for time and all eternity. So you can't really do that. And then on top of that, you have friends and family there that are with you. So there's an immense pressure to stay. And so I stayed. And we went through the ceremony. And then you're told that when you approach the veil to go into heaven after you die, you have to know your name, and then on top of that, you are going to be taught handshakes, and the guardian that stand outside of the veil, the gates of heaven, they are going to make you do these handshakes, and if you don't know these handshakes, then you can't get into heaven. Well,
wow.
At this point in the ceremony, I was so freaked out and weirded out that I couldn't really remember the handshakes. So I'm going, in my mind, I'm saying to myself, oh man, like, I'm not going to get into heaven. I don't know these handshakes. And the guy that was mimicking these with me, he literally had to force my hands into certain areas so I would do these handshakes. And my wife and I get through this ceremony, and in the temple, there is a room that is called the celestial room, and Mormons would say that on earth, that is the closest thing to heaven that we have on earth. And I remember, we're talking for a year and a half. This is what my wife and I had wanted and what we had envisioned. And I remember being in that room and holding my wife's hand, and my wife looks at me and she's like, Brian, you're squeezing my hand too hard. And I was freaked out, and I said to her, I just want to leave. And we left, and Mormons are given garments. Well, Mormons who have been through the temple are given garments to wear. That's the whole special underwear thing. So we got home that day, and I took my garments off, and I said, I'm not wearing these things until I find out what the heck that was that we just went through, and what it's all about. My wife stopped wearing her garments about a week later, and we were speaking about it now. I now, being a Christian and understanding spiritual warfare and understanding the reality of demonic presences, I truly believe that I was experiencing an overwhelming demonic sense in the temple. That's what it was. I didn't know that then, but looking back, I can know that now. So we go, okay, man, this temple thing was weird, and we need to figure out what happened. And so where do we go? Well, we go to our bishop, who is the local leader, and start talking to him about it. And his answer to us was, well, you need to keep going. If the first time it freaks everybody out, but you keep going, and eventually you'll feel the Spirit. And my thought was that was really bad advice, because, what I said to him is, if I go to a restaurant and I eat food, if I eat a bowl of food and I get sick because of it, and let's say I have leftovers, I'm not going to keep eating it until I feel better. That doesn't make sense. So I said, I want to know why the things that happened in the temple happened, and until I know that, I'm not going back. And then he had me talk to my stake president, which that is a higher person, more authority in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same thing. Hey, keep going to the temple. And that just never registered with me as a good answer. Mm. So we all sort of came to an agreement that I would just read the scriptures. And by scriptures, I don't mean Bible. I mean Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. And so that's what I started to do.
Mm. So just before you continue there, I've got hundreds of questions in my mind, but I wonder, the things in the temple then, they didn't give you any explanation as to, say for instance, oh, this is why we chant and this is why we have the handshakes. I mean, is that in the writings of Joseph Smith? Where did they get it from, or did they give you an explanation?
So you're not given an explanation really in the temple. It's more of, this is just the way it is. You know, if you're going to get into heaven, you got to have the handshakes. And the whole idea is, well, where do you learn the handshakes? Well, you only learn the handshakes in the temple. So it validates your faith because you go, hey, I'm glad that I'm a Mormon. I'm glad that I'm a member of this church because, you know, I'm being a bit I'm being a bit extreme with this example, but it's still a very true one. You know, all those Christians, all those Protestants, all those whatever, fill in the blank, they don't know these things. So they're going to be surprised when they come up to the gates of heaven and they don't know the handshakes and they're sent away. I mean, literally, that's what the Mormon is thinking when they're going through the temple. Now, after the fact, and I'll get to it in my story, but after the fact, studying the history of the church and specifically Joseph Smith, you find out that Joseph Smith was a Mason, and that a lot of these temple ordinances and temple things that people go through, practices that people go through, they are very Masonic. So that's the origination of it. But you know, if you're at a temple on a random Saturday, we'll say, and you see a young couple going into the temple to get married, they are not told that this is Masonic. They have no clue that where this came from. It is just very simply, this is what I have to do to get into heaven.
Wow. That's incredible, really. And yet, I presume that because of the authority of the church and the leaders who you were serving under, let's say, you're put in a position where you're thinking, well, they know more than I do. They're far more knowledgeable, so I have to accept it on some level.
Yeah, so if you're talking to a member of the Mormon faith, there's going to be a couple of things that you're going to learn really quickly. One is their dependence on their own feelings, and two, the superiority of Mormon leaders in the individual Mormon's life. And what I mean by that is, when you're a member of the church, we're told, you know, the prophet, the living prophet, has direct connection to Jesus Christ and to the Father. So it is you don't question, you just do what that person tells you to do. And if you do question, then you are immediately come under suspicion as to, well, wait a minute, why are you questioning? Is there some sin in your life? Is there some problem that you have that you're not disclosing that's causing you to do this? Are you under the influence of the devil? These are the things that when Mormons do question, that they are met with almost instantaneously.
And that is familiar to me because I used to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's the same situation, that you cannot question the teachings, not on any real level anyway, because if you do, you're immediately in trouble, basically, with the leaders. It sounds a lot similar, you know, in that way.
Yeah, I'm familiar, and this is what I tell Christians when I talk to them. I'm familiar with the Jehovah's Witness teachings as well, and I always say, from a biblical standpoint, Jehovah's Witnesses are closer to Orthodox Christianity than Mormons. But when it comes to the way that we outwardly appear, Mormons outwardly appear to be closer to Orthodox Christianity than Jehovah's Witnesses. But the one thing that those two faiths share is an absolute need for control over their individual members' lives and a perfect obedience, which is the leaders know, you do not, and you do not question, and if you do, then there's something wrong with you. There's never anything wrong with them.
Yes, absolutely.
So for us, we're going, okay, we're going to read the scriptures. And my wife and I, our stories diverge a little bit in why we left the Mormon faith. But for me, it was, okay, I'm going to read the scriptures. And I always tell people, I started with one problem, which was the temple. And then as I started to read the Book of Mormon, I go, hey, man, there's a lot of problems in here. And I ended reading the Book of Mormon. Now I have 50 problems. And then I started to read the Doctrine and Covenants, which are, Mormons consider them canonized scripture. And they're basically the alleged prophecies of Joseph Smith that he's getting from Jesus Christ. And when I read the Doctrine and Covenants, I went from 50 problems to 500 problems. And then it was, I'm going to study the history of the church. And when I studied the history of the church and was introduced to things like blacks not getting the priesthood, and which is a big deal in Mormonism, because if you have to have the priesthood to go to the temple. So if you don't have the priesthood, you can't go to the temple. If you can't go to the temple, you literally cannot be with God in heaven. So it's essentially damning people to not being with the Father in heaven, specifically because of their race. That was a big problem. Then polygamy was another problem. And it all, and this sounds really, when I tell this to people, they'll go, really, Brian, a TV show? But I'm going through all of these things, and then there was an HBO show that was done called Big Love, and it was a show about polygamous fundamentalist Mormons in Utah. And my wife and I are watching one of the episodes, and there's a reenactment where the prophet guy looks in a hat, has a rock and a hat, and he's looking in the hat to get a prophecy. And I'm going, there's no way that that's how Joseph Smith did it. So immediately, let's go online and let's find it out. Sure enough, that's how Joseph Smith did it. And it was just so preposterous that it was sort of it was accumulation of things, problems with the Mormon scriptures, and then the problems with the history, where I came to the conclusion, and my wife did at the same time as well, that this is not the true church. There's a problem here. And that we would have come to that conclusion about a year later, so it would have been late 05, early 06, roughly. And I always tell people when they ask me this, they'll say, "Oh, so you left and became a Christian right away?" No, absolutely not. We stayed in the church 8 more years, and
wow.
The idea was for us was, okay, this is not the true church. There's obviously some problems here, but it's better than all those Christian faiths, Baptist, Methodist, all this stuff. It's better than that, because we were told that by our leaders over and over and over again. So if you've had the best and it's not true, why would you try the rest? That was the mentality that we had. And then coupled with that, there's a natural distrust of the Bible in Mormonism. So it's almost like we would avoid the Bible. And I know there are some Mormons, if they're listening to this, they'll say, oh, I read the Bible. And I know that to be true, that there are some that will read the Bible, but that wasn't us, and that's not the majority of people. And I would say even the Mormons that do read the Bible, the problem is they're reading the Bible, and you being a former Jehovah's Witness, you would know this better than anybody. They're reading the Bible with Mormon lenses on, the same way that Jehovah's Witnesses read the Bible with Jehovah's Witness lenses on. So it is a spiritual clouding of what they're reading. So we stayed in the church for another 8 years.
Wow. I mean, oh wow. I heard actually that that the Joseph Smith Bible exists, that he did a version of the Bible which is different from the original. Is that right?
So he basically was going to restore the Bible because it had issues. The Mormons believe that the Bible is correct as far as it's translated correctly. Interestingly enough, he then went and did a retranslation called the Joseph Smith translation. But Mormons today really don't use that. And they use the excuse, they say, well, the reason why we don't really use it is because the Reformed LDS Church has access. They have the proprietary rights to that. But they have it. I mean, if you were to download the LDS app on your phone, you could pull up the Joseph Smith translation to readily have made available. So there's no reason for them not to use it. But I think the reason that they don't use it is, I mean, it's pretty preposterous. You know, I'll give you an example. In Genesis, when Joseph is talking to his family, and he, at the end of Genesis, in the Joseph Smith translation, Joseph Smith inserted himself there. Joseph has a prophecy about another Joseph that will come to restore the church, and that is, you're led to believe that that's Joseph Smith. It is a very corrupt translation of the Bible, there's no doubt.
And so, how you're talking about, you believed that this was, even though it's not true altogether, that this was the best Christian church that you could be part of. So I'm interested to hear how Mormons view other Christians of other denominations and how they speak of them, and where do they believe we are going to end up when we die?
So if you're talking with a Mormon, this is very different than Jehovah's Witnesses. The one thing that I appreciate about Jehovah's Witnesses is they will be willing to engage. Now, they may only be willing to engage until the Christian makes sound points, and then they don't want to engage anymore. But the problem when you're talking with a Mormon as a Christian is they generally don't want to engage. And Mormons have this saying that if there is contention in the air, that is evidence of the spirit of the devil being present. So what that really means for us as Christians is anytime that we would make a point that would make the Mormon feel uncomfortable, they will interpret that as contention and a spirit of the devil, so they will not want to really engage further. So it's very difficult to talk to a Mormon person about the true God and Christian faith. But the way that the Mormon would view the Christian is you have some truth, you don't have all the truth, and in Mormonism there is this degree of heaven. So there are 3 heavens, and then there's outer darkness, which would be the Mormon version of hell. So most Mormons would look at Christians and go, well, you guys have some truth, and you guys are going to make it to the 2nd heaven, and that's good enough for you guys, but only Mormons go to the top heaven. And that's saved exclusively for us. So Mormons would look at Christians almost with some pity, I would say, because they would view, your general Christian is not going to be in the top level of heaven.
And why do they then ally themselves with other Christian groups? I've seen Mormon leaders, shaking hands with leaders of other Christian denominations. How do they see that?
Yeah, there's definitely, and it's definitely a shift. When I was growing up as a member of the church, it was, we're the true church, those Christians are wrong, and that has definitely changed. And I tell people when I talk to them, I go, I was the last generation that was taught that. Now it's sort of an outwardly expression of what I would call universalism, being given out by the Mormon leaders, which is, hey, we're all children of God, we're all going to the same place, it's all good, but then privately there's still the demands that Mormonism is the only way to get to the celestial kingdom, which is what they call the top level of heaven. And the only way you get there is through Mormonism. So it's sort of like, hey, outwardly we're going to practice this universalism, but inwardly nothing's changed. And then I definitely see Mormonism trying to gain acceptance into Christianity. And it's one of the reasons why I agreed to do this interview, and it's one of the reasons why I do the ministry work I do with Mormons. Is Mormonism from a Christian perspective is probably the one faith that is least like Christianity, and yet I see them gaining acceptance in some mainstream Christian denominations to where those denominations will work with them on interfaith projects. And I go, in my mind, I'm thinking, you're being played as a fool, because these people, if the theology of Mormonism, and I use that term loosely, but if that is Christian, to where they should get acceptance into the body, then we have a big problem, because Mormons believe that God is on a planet called Kolob, and that or lives nearest to the planet called Kolob. Mormon men believe that they are going to become gods, and then on top of that, Mormons still believe in spiritual polygamy. Even though they don't practice polygamy on earth, they believe that in heaven they will be practicing spiritual polygamy, to the point that the prophet of the Mormon church today is a spiritual polygamist. He has a wife that passed away, but in Mormonism he's still married to her, and then now he's married again to another woman. And in Mormonism, when he gets to heaven, both of those women will be his wives. And interestingly enough, the chapter, D&C, Doctrine and Covenants 132, which is all about polygamy, is still not removed from Mormon scripture. So this is not a faith that is Christian in any way, shape, or form. But I do find that they are trying to get mainstream Christian acceptance.
And that would make sense, because if they can get accepted more, then their organisation is only going to grow more and more as unsuspecting Christians join, because they just see it as a nice denomination with nice people who do a lot of charity work. Because I know that Mormons, from what I can tell, seem to do lots of charity work and other things, and they live very moral lives. So it's something that would be attractive maybe to Christians who don't suspect what the group's really about and what's behind the group.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally correct in saying Mormons live moral lives. Mormons are some of the best best people you'll meet. I mean, as kind, gentle-hearted people that you'll meet. And it's one of the things that breaks my heart is they're so kind. And when Paul talks about believers who are not believers, but people who have zeal, but it's applied ignorantly and incorrectly, that is that's what I attribute to Mormonism, in that the people are so filled with zeal to the point that they will go on a 2-year mission and sacrifice 2 years of their life. And not only when they're 18 and 19, but many times when they become older couples, retiree age, they'll again 2, 3, 4 years. And it is just, unfortunately, they are deceived and in a system that unfortunately was created by a con man who has created a lie. And it is a very, very sad thing. And, I speak from personal experience, looking back, having multiple family members that are still Mormon today. It breaks your heart when you think about it.
So how did you eventually end up leaving the church properly and coming to Christianity?
So, this is the other part of Mormonism that is really scary, is it is a pathway to agnostic and atheistic beliefs. And unfortunately for my wife and I, that's what happened to us. We left the church in 2014 and we became agnostic, sort of self-help agnostic. It was like, name it, we claim it. If we believe it, we can achieve it. And yeah, there may be some kind of God up there, but he doesn't care about us. And we lived that way for 3 years. And in 2017, we had a series of events where we were brought to our knees. And for a living, I ran a real estate investment company, and I'd go around the world doing presentations and working with people. And we were very successful with that. And we had a situation where in 2017, we discovered that we had a partner who was embezzling from us. And that essentially caused us to go into a situation where we had to liquidate the business. And it was devastating. I mean, my wife and I had spent 16 years of our life building this business, and everything that we had built, all the hours, all the work, all of the achievements, and really our self-worth, our self-worth was tied into our material achievements in life. And so when you start to lose that, you're really left with nothing. And my wife and I, we became very depressed to the point of having suicidal thoughts. And my wife says one day, she says to me, I'm going to start to read the Bible. And my response was, hey, you know what? We didn't need Jesus when we were on our way up with our business, and we don't need Jesus now that we're at the bottom. It was to be very cynical with her. But she continued to do those things, read the Bible, and then an interesting thing happened. She said, I need to start watching some sermons. So she goes immediately, General Conference, Mormon sermons with Mormon prophets, and she's going, in her mind, she's getting nothing out of them, and she's not being fulfilled at all. So she said that she was going to start to watch some Christian pastors' sermons. So she's doing that, and her disposition is starting to improve and getting better, and mine, I'm still down in the dumps. And one day it just all came to a head where I went into my room and I said the most un-Mormon prayer ever. Mormons, it's a very ceremonial kind of thing when you pray. You fold your arms, you bow your head, the prayer is sort of in King James English, where you have these and thous and arts and that kind of stuff. And that night when I said this prayer, it was just the simplest prayer is, Jesus, dude, if you're there, man, I need help because I cannot carry this weight. And, you know, it was amazing, the comfort and the peace that I felt when I said that prayer. And I don't consider that my born-again moment, because we started going to church, and we said, okay, my wife said we need to go to church. And I kept kind of like blowing it off. And then she said, okay, look, if you don't pick a church, I'm going to go back to the Mormon church. Well, we knew it wasn't true, and we'd left already, and it was like, we're not going back to that. So I said, all right, well, I'll pick a church. So here in Texas, there are a lot of Christian churches. So I said, okay, I'm going to pick a church called Grace Church. And the day came, and we were driving down the street, and sure enough, there's 3 Grace churches right by each other. I'm going, oh no, which one am I supposed to go to? And we picked one. We walked in, and for Christians that are listening to this, you know, when I tell this part of the story, they're quick to sort of laugh and chuckle, but it is very serious for Mormon people as they're transitioning out of Mormonism and into a real relationship with Jesus. These are the things that they go through. So we're walking into this Christian church, and we immediately turn to the right. And we were prepared that Christians weren't going to all be in suits and ties, so we were okay with that. But we turned to the right, and sure enough, there's a coffee bar. And Christians are drinking coffee, and we're like, oh no, you know, you're not supposed to have coffee. And then we go into the sermon, or to the service, and, you know, they're singing, and they're playing a guitar, and they're playing drums, and it's like, this is not reverent. This is not the way it's supposed to be. So Mormons, as they're transitioning out of Mormonism, they go through these mental barriers that they have to break down. So be loving and be patient with Mormons that are transitioning out, because it does take a lot of time. But so we went to that church, and then we kept going to churches. And February 26, 2017, we found ourselves in a church, and the pastor is going through the sermon. The end of the sermon, it was baptisms. And my wife and I are sitting there and watching these baptisms. And by the end of the baptismal service, I look at my wife, and she's just bawling, crying uncontrollably. And then I realized, wait a minute, I'm crying. And it was just a very sweet moment for us. And that day we gave our lives to the Lord, and haven't looked back ever since. You know, God has been so good to us, and so faithful to us. And we immediately said, you know, we need to get in with a Sunday school class. So the church that we go to, you're talking about a city, San Antonio, of over 2.5 million people, roughly. And it just so happens that the church that we go to and the Sunday school class that we randomly walked into had a couple that has a ministry to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. So it was like God's looking out for us, putting us with people who can help us and disciple us and walk with us. And now we do an outreach to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. But with Mormons, we go to the temple, and we just stand outside the temple here in Texas and look for conversations. And then we also go back to Utah, which Utah is where you have the largest concentration of Mormons. We go back to Utah regularly and have conversations with them. We go to the Missionary Training Center, and we go to the Temple Square where they have their large temple, and we just get into conversations with people. And again, God has been faithful to send out people to make divine appointments. Every time we go out, we know we're getting divine appointments, and we've seen people now come out of the Mormon faith because of our efforts. So it's been amazing to see God work in our lives, and it's been amazing to see God work in other people's lives.
Oh, praise God for that. That's amazing. I love hearing stories like yours, because I've interviewed other people who have come out of certain groups, and God is so gracious. Even in my story, it's the same as yours in a way, that I went to a church and found it difficult at first, but the leader of the church was an expert in Jehovah's Witnesses, and so it just shows that God knows what He's doing when we need to find people who help us and guide us. He provides those people, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, God is. I think about it because I do investments for a living, which basically is math, and you start to try to process. I mean, what are the statistical probabilities that we would pick a Sunday school class in one that we would end up in a church that has experts who have ministry to Mormons, but then also that we would pick the same Sunday school class that they go to. You start to do that process in your head, and the only answer that you can come away with is it's God. It's just God is good, and praise to Him.
Absolutely. And I'm so pleased as well that you're now taking this to other people, helping other people to exit Mormonism. It's amazing. I just feel that the more of us that speak publicly as well, the better, so we can educate Christians listening to this who have no sort of background in any of these groups. It's helping them to realise and to be protected as well, protecting them and their families, so that they know not to join. And all of these things are so important, and just to summarise, if you're speaking to someone who is currently, they're walking into the LDS temple, what kind of thing are you saying to them? Are you keeping it really simple, and what's the message that you're trying to get across as best as you can?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a story of one of the times that we were out there. It was myself and another brother, and we're standing outside the LDS temple, and we have two missionaries walk by, and we get into a conversation with them, and they just filled with arrogance and pride, and it was just not a fruitful conversation. So they pass us and go up into the temple, and about 2 minutes later, a young man comes jogging by, and he's in jogging clothes, so there's no real idea that this guy's a member of the church or not. But he then runs up into the temple, on the temple grounds, I should say, and we see him talking with those missionaries who had a rough conversation with us. And about 5 minutes later, this young man comes running back out, and we get into a conversation with him. And about 1 minute into the conversation, he tells us that he's 20. And I know, being a former member of the church, that if you're 20 and you're not on your mission, there's something wrong. I of course, know this firsthand. So I asked him, I said, well, why aren't you on your mission? And he says to us, he goes, well, I have an addiction to pornography, and I have a drug problem, and I'm trying to be worthy of Jesus' love so I can go on my mission. And we proceeded to talk to this young man for about 25 minutes, and the conversation was basically, let's talk about the Jesus of the Gospels and who Jesus talked to, because he was hanging out he wasn't hanging out with people who were outwardly worthy, who were outwardly moral. He was hanging out with the people at the bottom when they were at their most bottomness, when there was no outwardly worthiness in them. And those were the people that he was ministering to and being with. And we told this young man, look, there's nothing that you can do to be worthy of Jesus' love. You paying your tithing and saying you're not going to drink coffee and trying to establish your own works righteousness is not going to do anything. And all you have to do is lay comfortably in what Christ has already done. And it is those kind of conversations that we go out for, having faith that God will send those people to us, and then those are the conversations that happen time and time again.
About the grace of God. That's perfect, really, because that we know that that's the yoke of slavery, of being enslaved to a group or to men or to some standard that they set for us. And yet I remember pointing out to some LDS missionaries myself the verses in Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8 and 9 where it says that we're saved by grace and that it is the gift of God. And it was strange because they actually were quite surprised by that verse, as though they didn't even know it existed.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can have one conversation biblically with a Mormon, I would suggest Ephesians 2, 8, 9, as you said, and I would contrast that with Galatians 5, where Paul is talking about if you try and establish yourself according to the law, works righteousness, that you sever yourself from Christ, you sever yourself from grace. And what I always ask a Mormon is, do you know another Mormon who has done that? Do you know another Mormon who is righteous because they obey every single commandment and they've never broken a commandment? And the answer always is no. And then it's, well, don't sever yourself from Christ. Don't sever yourself from grace trying to be worthy. And inevitably the Mormon will say, well, how am I doing that? And my answer is always, I'll point to the temple and I'll say, well, if Christ did it, if he paid it all, then what do you need this temple for? And the reality is the Mormon is trying to establish their own righteousness. Their faith demands that. In Mormonism, Christ gets you resurrected, but he has very little to do with where you will end up as far as your place with God. That is up to the individual Mormon. So that's why they go to the temple. That's why they have such zeal to do these, as you said, works for the poor and good works that you had talked about. It's because they're trying to establish their own righteousness before God. And as we as believers know, all of those works are like filthy rags to a holy God. So we have to communicate to them that grace was won by Jesus on the cross for all of us, and now all we have to do is rest in that, versus the attaching the chains of man-made religion and works righteousness on ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's a feature of many, many groups, and that's one of the reasons that this show exists, because this show is trying to defend the gospel, and the people that I interview and the people that I talk to on a regular basis are pointing out to Christians that, there are these groups where people are in slavery and they're trying to establish their own righteousness. And as you said, all righteousness comes through Jesus Christ as a gift because he did it. He was made sin so that we might be declared righteous. So, yeah, it's perfect that you're able to now be able to make people more aware as well. It's brilliant, Brian.
Yeah, and what I would say to a Mormon, if they're listening to this, is, I'll share my personal experience, which was, When I was in the church, the Mormon church, my opinion of Jesus was essentially, he's my older brother who sort of, he's got me beat in seniority in that he was the firstborn, and he has shown me the way. And I remember reading in a Mormon book written by one of their leaders, and they talk about the atonement. They talk about Christ, and the analogy that is given is, imagine you're in a lake and you're kind of drowning, you're panicking, you're drowning. Well, they say, well, Jesus is on the side of the land, and he's holding a pole, and he's sticking out the pole to you, and you have to swim to the pole and grab it. And that, in a synopsis, summarizes the Mormon thought about Jesus, and that was very much my thought. And what I know to be the truth now is, as it says in Ephesians 2, no, I'm dead. I'm dead in my sins and trespasses. So literally, to use that lake analogy that Mormons use so much, I'm not swimming. I'm at the bottom of the lake and I'm dead. And Jesus dives in, he grabs me, brings me up to land, and then he literally breathes life into me. And just think about that. You've got a Jesus on the land who's sticking out a pole, and he's trying to say, hey, grab the pole, grab the pole. That's a totally different Christ than the Christ who dives into the lake, goes to the very bottom, he picks me up, he breathes life into me. And what I would say, to a Mormon who's listening to this is, one, be a truth seeker above everything. It's one of the things that I find so refreshing about being a Christian is, if I'm talking to an atheist and that atheist says, hey, I've got this pamphlet that you should read, I can read it. And when I was a Mormon, if I was talking to a Christian and they said, read this, it was like, no, if I read it, my eyes are going to burn out of my head. And I can't read anything that is not approved by my leaders. Christians do not fear reading other information, because we are at our fundamental, we are truth seekers, and we want to engage with people. It's what I always say, if 10 Mormons came up to my church this Sunday and said, hey, we want to talk to you guys, there'd be 1,000 Christians wanting to talk to them. But when I was a Mormon, if 10 Christians came to my church, it would be like, I can't look at them, I can't talk to them, I can't hear them, because nothing good will happen from it. So be a truth seeker. And then the second thing that I would suggest to the Mormon is, be open to the fact that you may not have all of the answers. And then when you get those answers, which are biblically based, have the courage to submit yourself to Jesus, who literally went to the cross and died for you and paid for your sins, and be willing to submit to him, and be humble enough to accept his free gift that he gives willingly. And many times when I'm talking to Mormons, they'll say, that sounds too simple. And the thing that breaks my heart, Dawn, is so many Mormons they go, it's too simple, and they say, because it's too simple, it can't be real. And when you really read the Gospels, it comes out time and time and time again. I mean, you talked about Ephesians 2:8, 9. It can't be more clear than that. That this is a free gift. All you have to do is have faith in Christ, rest in him and the work that he's already accomplished on the cross, and believe. And yet, so many of them choose to reject that such sweet gospel that is so precious to my wife and I now.
Yeah, and praise God that you are both free now, and you're both Christian. You've got Jesus as the centre of your life. That's absolutely amazing. And we're running out of time. I'm sad to say, but it's been so fascinating speaking to you and listening to your story. I really appreciate you coming onto the show and sharing all of that with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you, and hope you have a great day.